Okay, so welcome and hello to our viewers. We are delighted that you are tuning in to join our conversation today on the impact of COVID-19 and its relation to prisons, jails, along with the communities that are living and working inside those institutions. My name is Abby Hansen, and I am joined by my colleague Jen Davison. Both of us are incoming editors on the Journal of Law and Inequality at the University of Minnesota Law School. And our conversation today is part of a broader project by the Journal of Law and Inequality that's really designed to connect viewers and students with legal experts so we can have this dialogue about the issues surrounding law, inequality, and the coronavirus. Today, we are lucky enough to be joined by Professor Susanna Blumenthal, who is the William Prosser Professor of Law and is also a faculty member in the History Department here at the University of Minnesota, in addition to being the co-director of the university's program in Law and History. Both Jen and I also had Professor Blumenthal for our criminal law class during our initial year of law school, so we are especially excited to get to talk with you, Professor Blumenthal, and thank you so much for agreeing to be part of this dialogue. I'm going to start out with just a few questions about law school, the criminal law, and the coronavirus, and then sort of move into this broader idea of criminal law history and the coronavirus. So just to start out with that, Jen and I are among the many students who are very appreciative of stressors. You, like us, are dealing sort of with these stressors brought on by the pandemic, but you've also, very short time frame, had to convert your classes, your foundational class, entirely digital. So how are you as a faculty member sort of working through all of the changes that COVID has put on you teaching-wise?
Well, I have survived the semester, so I feel a sense of relief. I mean, I felt it's a weird form of being exhausted that comes from just, you're dashing from one thing to another, but you never move from this space where I'm talking to you right now. And there was immediately a very weird sense of exhaustion that I think a lot of us experienced doing something that was not seemingly physically demanding, but was demanding in a lot of different ways all at once. And so I'm relieved to be able to say that I have made it through the semester reasonably well, I hope. But I also sort of immediately missed the kind of days that I had structured with the kind of engagement with students. I realized both during and after what a lifeline that was for me during this whole experience. It was, difficult in ways that no one, I think, anticipated. And finding meaning and some sense of connection through all of this was important, and the outlet that I had through the sessions with my students was absolutely among the most important ways of staying connected and seeing the significance of all of this. So I feel grateful that I have made it through also without experiencing any health-related problems, nor anyone near and dear to me. So that's something I have to be extremely grateful about. So yeah, I have exams to grade now, which is also a surprisingly fun and engaging activity. So,
well, I'm glad to hear that you made it through onto exams. Do you think there was something, or there is something about criminal law that makes it maybe a little more difficult to teach digitally than other courses? Or do you think there are teaching methods that you appreciated about digital coursework that you're going to include once we finally meet in person again?
Well, I think that criminal law does present special kinds of challenges. The nature of the material is sensitive, and I think one of the things that I would have found probably challenging in any course, but I think in particular criminal law, is just the ability to see how my material is and what other people are saying is being received. And when you have to sort of the Brady Bunch boxes, it's really hard to to get a sense of not only what people are comprehending, but also things that are generating discomfort or difficulty. And so it was especially challenging and worrying to me, actively worrying to me, to be moving through topics that are just the bread and butter of a criminal law course, whether they have to do with, sexual violence or any other kind of violence. They're just topics that engender all sorts of emotions and difficult concepts that are vastly better addressed in an in-person kind of class. So there certainly was that feature of the situation. I will say that the breakout rooms were kind of a pretty interesting vehicle through which to sort of have conversations, and dipping in and out of those was kind of fun. It was vastly more kind of difficult to figure out in the first instance than just saying go into your circles in a classroom setting. But there was something about that interface that actually enabled conversations that I think might not have otherwise happened as well. So I was sort of glad for that piece of it. But I do think there's just an irreducibly valuable aspect to teaching that has to do with being in person. And so even as there's talk now about how we're, some of the, I think, unduly optimistic conversations that are happening now about sort of how this puts us ahead of the curve in terms of learning how to go online, which is the wave of the future. I both hope that's not true and just have to believe it will not be true. That there are just things about the process of learning in person that I think should, and I hope will, continue to be valuable aspects of not only higher ed, but all levels of education. And so I think there are things that we can do digitally and should do, and already are. I mean, like, it's revolutionized, all sorts of areas that I work in, especially historical. The things that have been digitized, that have been preserved thereby, are terribly important to the work that I do. And it has enabled whole new fields of knowledge to open up, notably in newspapers that were, sort of insurmountably difficult to study in any way that sort of was extensive. We can now, with keyword searches, search, and that's also true of case law back into the 19th century. So the fact that we can digitize things and communicate in the way that we are now is something to be, kind of embraced in all sorts of ways. And so I'm glad that I have a new level of comfort about being on Zoom. But I very much hope that we don't lose sight of the value and impact that comes from face-to-face education.
Yeah. You bring up the news, which is certainly something that we wanted to talk to you a bit about, both as your expertise certainly seems to be part of the larger news discussion right now related to Corona and incarcerated individuals. We also wanted to tap your expertise as a person who knows all of those things, and your own personal response to understanding over time, just like all of us, that there was a pandemic coming to the US, that it would be a big deal, and watching all of that unfold. We wondered what you, with your expertise, were thinking. What was crossing your mind as you understood all of that?
It took a while to sink in, I think, and think about in terms of my expertise, right? I think I experienced it first and foremost as a human, coming home from an academic conference, that it was an international conference that, was on the East Coast, and sort of in slow motion realizing what I had just done. And, I hadn't come to arms with Purell or anything like that. And I was just, sort of as kind of caught off guard as pretty much everyone else in that regard. But as I started to it felt like the second time I'd lived through something that I knew would be studied historically, and that kind of strange or surreal feeling of knowing as a historian that what I was living through was something that was going to be the object of study in a sort of very clear sense. The other time, of course, is 9/11. That was another moment where I knew I was living through something in real time that was really going to be significant and viewed in some way as a consequential moment in history. And so, it took a while for me to just move from the level of experiencing it to the level of thinking about it. And even as I thought about it, I immediately appreciated the ways in which those living through a consequential moment in history are, only dimly aware of what it means, right? And to get the appropriate level of historical distance, when it becomes history that people can study is an interesting question. And I just simply knew that I wasn't there yet in terms of being able to study it as a historian exactly. I was just too much in the moment myself, and so felt more like I should just be witnessing it in some way that could be recorded. And there are projects like that have immediately taken off, which is kind of intriguing, that there's just an immediate attempt on the part of different, like the Smithsonian has something, Library of Congress has something, that they're just gathering narratives and other kinds of forms of documentation so that we as historians have the material with which to study this at a longer distance from the now. But I think what I started to reflect on most immediately was something I'd already been noticing in our discourse, which is this, claim that we're living through something that is unprecedented, or something that's happening is unprecedented, and I can't help as a legal historian to sort of, immediately fixate on that word unprecedented and try to figure out what it means and what we imply when we speak in those terms, and what we think we know about how unusual we are in confronting something. And so I think that one of the things that is, I carry with me all the time is a certain kind of skepticism about how truly unprecedented this is. Haven't we seen this before? Probably we have in some form. And, while I think that what we're going through right now is certainly unprecedented in our lifetimes, it's certainly not unprecedented in human history to see this kind of decimation occasioned by a virus or some sort of naturally occurring kind of threat to human well-being. And I think the other historical constant that immediately comes to mind as I witness this unfolding is just that the most vulnerable are the most adversely affected by things like this. And so it just shines a light on pre-existing inequality and injustice. That's the sad kind of constant that we see across time. And, so one of the things that I guess immediately started to really kind of get to me was the way that there was this we're all in it together idea was, constantly cable news, our university communications, everyone everywhere sort of chiming in with this idea, which is in some respects true in a good way potentially, but it, I think, glosses over the ways in which this virus is affecting and most immediately and most severely impacting those who are the poorest, the least powerful, the most vulnerable. They're the ones that are at the greatest risk of infection with the least resources to combat this virus. And so, I guess what I kept thinking is, while you hear this idea the virus doesn't discriminate, we do. And so it's no surprise, given that there's so much evidence of the ways in which the African American community is noticeably more impacted by this. And then as we turn to the topic that we're focused on here today, incarcerated people are, of course, experiencing the virus in a way that's very distinct and distinctly horrible. So those are the kinds of things that kind of immediately come to me as a historian, and a historian of law in particular, and someone who thinks about criminal law. So
yeah. You mentioned sort of the narratives that are flowing, one of them being that we're all so interdependent together. One of the things that struck me when I'm reading articles that are specifically calling out the way that prisons, jails, and incarcerated people, and also people who work there, are sort of their own ecosystem that's kind of pulled out of the rest of society and separated, and maybe that same message of interdependence isn't there or is missing. And I wondered if you had thoughts about the way that the language that's being used to discuss jails and prisons and people who live and work in them is maybe recreating some of the same old stigmas or cultural assumptions about what kind of rights people have when they're imprisoned and how those compare to sort of the larger population's rights.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's sort of, again, you sort of see in the immediate sort of PR moves that are made by these institutions to combat the, you know, sort of scrutiny that's placed upon them in these moments, you know, that the upside of this is supposed to be these are controlled settings. And so unlike the rest of society where it's very hard to manage the desires people have to continue their lives and go to beaches or movies or whatever it is that they're doing that is technically not a good idea from the standpoint of public health, you know, they don't have the same ability to control those populations from doing things that are potentially damaging, whereas in a prison setting, they can sort of manage this. And so there's a technocratic idea that you hear sort of from prison administrators that sounds in the kind of we can do the kind of tracing that you can't do in the broader society within, and so that's how we're managing, we're on top of this, but you know, evidence to the contrary is everywhere to be found at the moment, so that only takes you so far. And that's, you know, the positive spin that sometimes at least could ameliorate the tendencies towards just reproducing stigma and other forms of social sort of distancing that are of the worst sorts. And so I think, I mean, there's so much in the language that we're using right now that's interesting to think about in particular. So I've been thinking a lot about social distancing, both as a positive thing that we're all doing now for each other and to sort of, you know, flatten the curve, as opposed to the forms of social distancing and a sort of segregation that are sort of part of the punishment that is our, you know, prison system. And so there's a kind of interesting way in which the language just takes on an entirely different meaning when you're thinking about those who are in these spaces. And the irony, of course, is that they can't social distance in the place that we're all, you know, sort of creating to distance ourselves from them. And so that's just, you know, one of the deep ironies of this particular moment. And so I think that there's a lot, at least potentially, in the way that we're talking about this right now that could cut in the direction of reinforcing in the ways that you suggest. One of the things that I sort of like about this moment, I don't like is way too strong a word, I'll retract that immediately, but one of the things that I think is an opportunity, and I'm looking for opportunities all the time. I mean, I think that this is, these moments of deep destabilization and dislocation can be moments of real opportunity to sort of push through to something else. And so one of the things that I think is really interesting is how much certain organizations, you know, different civil rights organizations, different university-based clinics and things like that, including ours, are shining light on the situation and using this moment as a time to push forward initiatives towards decarceration. And so I do think that there is a lot in this moment, you know, just the practicalities of the situation, the need to try to, you know, sort of reduce the density of these spaces does create opportunities to really think through whether prison is the right answer for all instances in which we've labeled someone a criminal, and to take this moment as a moment not only to sort of do something that's just an emergency measure, which is what a lot of this is right now, but to try to really think through sort of the larger sort of social policy initiatives and the practicality of actually pushing those forward right now, I think becomes newly plausible in lots of ways. And I think, you know, media operations like the Marshall Project are another good example because they're using a lot of voices of incarcerated people right now. That's another form of documentation we're immediately getting, is that incarcerated people are writing about their experiences within these spaces in ways that I think can have impacts on how people think about what it is to be in those spaces and what it is to be isolated from human contact. One of the most affecting things I've read is from was a Marshall Project piece, and it was just talking about what it means to be in solitary confinement during a period of social distancing outside of the prison setting, and, you know, to sort of identify, you know, why these are, you know, sort of categorically different experiences, you know, even as people use, I mean, I think Ellen DeGeneres got rightly attacked for sort of saying that she felt like she was in prison, right? I mean, where she's living, I mean, since there was, I think, sort of visibly, like, you know, the visible sort of, her living room alone was something to behold, I think. So what I think is at least a potential opportunity is to focus us on, you know, sort of there is a way in which we can newly appreciate what it means to be isolated. Even as it's a very different experience, the fact that human beings need human touch, human contact, the ways in which we're not experiencing the forms of deprivation that we experience that are, sort of categorically different, I think do provide a basis for understanding the inhumanity of some of our practices, our punishment practices, in particular solitary confinement. And there have been, centuries of evidence suggest how devastating this is to human consciousness and human well-being, and maybe there's something in this moment that will generate a renewed understanding of how cruel that kind of form of punishment is.
One of the things I wanted to ask you, speaking of cruelty, is that I have read comments on articles that are related to people responding by saying that they think that when you take the risk of being convicted as a criminal, you take the risk of being imprisoned somewhere where a virus will, potentially sweep through, and that somehow you've sort of borne that risk in taking the actions you took to break the laws of the land. What kinds of responses would you give to people who maybe are not appreciating the opportunity to reimagine humanity in the way that criminal law works?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's hard to fight against that logic because it comes from, I think, an emotional place, and I think a place of panic, and in a time and a place of crisis, where triage is the rule. I think people start to think about relative value of different human lives in ways that I think are terrifying to think about the implications if we actually sort of institutionalize that. But it's also important to acknowledge that we do it all the time without acknowledging it, that all sorts of decisions are being made all the time in different settings within and outside of prisons, in hospitals right now. I mean, one of the things that I think has been an immediate concern, lots of family members who are doctors, is just how they're basically being asked to make those kinds of decisions. They knew as soon as this crisis hit that there was going to be limits in terms of what they were going to be able to do within these settings, given the estimates that were being made about the number of patients and the lack of resources. And so there are, all sorts of choices that are being made that require people to decide as between different, needy patients, and so I think that's there to begin with. And I think the ugliness of the way that some people respond to it is also inevitably going to become visible over and over again in lots of ways, because we have not adequately planned for this, even though there was lots of reason to think it was coming, not only in the short term, but in the longer term. And so we are where we are, and I think we're faced with some really, really painful choices as a result, and ethically complicated choices. But the one thing to the person who would claim that and make that argument that a person who is found guilty of a crime is therefore basically, in some respects, kind of needing to own the risk of becoming ill in these kinds of circumstances. I don't think that that's part of our criminal code. I don't think it's the way that we think about criminal punishment. And there are actual constitutional provisions that I think cut against that idea rather clearly, in addition to a body of both state and federal legislation that guarantees certain baselines. Now, are they enforced properly? Are they adequate? No, neither of those things are true of the existing, legal rules that we have in place, but we do have some constitutional backstops as well. And they're being tested right now in court. So we'll see, how strong they are and how well they work to kind of preserve life and guarantee a certain level of care and standards of just health and safety within these settings. But they are guarantees that are embedded in our legal system. And so that logic, I think, doesn't hold up in court, or at least it should not hold up in court.
Shifting to your own research, you have scholarship focused on both law and history. And you sort of alluded to earlier that this is maybe not so unprecedented, the situation that we're in. So how do you think past pandemics, like maybe HIV/AIDS or the Spanish flu, how those have impacted and shaped criminal law along with the constitutional protections of incarcerated people?
Well, it's one of the things that's immediately interesting to me as a historian. A lot of my work is about sort of kind of medical legal relations across time, and the ways in which both law and medicine are kind of shaping each other, and shaping social policy more broadly. So I alight immediately upon the term pandemic, right, and the kind of cultural work that term does. What does it mean to talk about a pandemic? It turns out there are some disagreements amongst those who use the word. In the medical field, there has been across time different ways of describing it. WHO has one definition, CDC, as you can sort of see the different, and while that may be just sort of mere linguistic sort of distinctions, that they actually do a lot of sort of consequential things in determining what populations were, when it rises to the level of a pandemic, what it means in terms of what kinds of resources are mobilized when we've determined it's a pandemic that we're talking about. And I think deciding what is a kind of condition that is susceptible to pandemic status is really interesting to think about. And of course, influenza is sort of at the heart of the meaning of the term. It's clearly, cholera is clearly in the category of things that can be of a pandemic proportion. But we could also think about obesity, for instance. Should that be? And people do. I mean, you see the analogies drawn. It's like an epidemic or a pandemic. And these are things that aren't sort of located in our biology or in sort of the realm of kind of medical science at all, in the first instance, but we sort of take them and use them in that way. And so I think it's interesting as a historian to see how we bound the term and what we sort of understand it to mean, and what kind of implications we draw from it, what populations are involved. I think it's always very consequential to pathologize things. And then sort of to turn to the more particular way in which you're asking about this in the context of criminal law, that's interesting because in some respects, to pathologize it may be to take it out of criminal law, right? If we model sort of the criminal law as about dealing with free will and sort of human choice, disease is understood as a constraint on free will and autonomy in all sorts of ways, or it often is. And yet we also sometimes take a disease and understand it to be something that, to go back to what Jen was saying, something you kind of found your way into. You became diseased because you chose to do that, not necessarily because you committed a crime, but maybe because you started drinking or using drugs, and then that rendered you sort of vulnerable to different kinds of diseases that we can sort of find some earlier moment in time that you did something to sort of bring upon yourself. And the more we can sort of show you to be someone who assumed the risk of that disease, the less likely we are to think of it in terms of sickness that requires some form of care and treatment rather than punishment. So I'm always interested and attentive to the ways in which the language of pathology operates to either encourage blame or to sort of engender some sense of sympathy and care, and the ways in which it bounds the kind of community of people who are deserving of our care and attention, and those who are then are actually sort of consigned to some sort of form of social death as a result of the kind of condition that they find themselves in. So that's been the main preoccupation of mine in looking at this issue. The other main site, and this is actually, I was in the middle of writing an essay when this all happened, and I've just really just kind of changed the kind of core concern as a result of living through this moment to really be attentive to the ways in which the prison and the history of the prison sort of intersects with this sort of moment. This is a moment and an opportunity to rethink whether the prison is the right mode of punishment for the forms of crime that we experience as a society. And I'm kind of in a moment of really trying to think through what explains why in so many moments, the history of criticizing prisons is almost as old as prisons themselves. They immediately, because of the promises that the, architects of prisons made that were not, sort of kept, and the ways in which their claims were not actually substantiated because of recidivism. There were all sorts of things about prisons that sort of came up short. And then they're obviously very expensive as well. You would expect at some moment in time we come to some new realization that there's another way forward, and yet there's a sort of persistence of the prison as the kind of default mechanism of punishment in our society. And the 1890s and into the sort of early 20th century was a moment where there was a dramatic amount of rethinking around the prison and other sort of modes, and people began to think we were going to move away from punishment altogether towards something called rehabilitation, which was really defined against sort of a punitive form of punishment. And as you know, that did not happen. But here we are in another moment where one might imagine that we could see some really dramatic change occur. I am sort of spending a lot of time thinking about what our sort of historical sources tell us about what does and doesn't make for an opportunity for real change in the history of an institution. And it doesn't leave me with a lot of optimism, but I'm going to continue to spend some time pressing forward with that question.
We know that in our prisons, the people that are incarcerated are primarily African-American men. And we also know that African-Americans have a higher prevalence of some health conditions that would put them at greater risk of serious health concerns due to COVID. So together, those are, like a perfect storm for our prison populations. So how do you, as a scholar of law and history, sort of grapple with those realities in our criminal justice system that have been produced and are perpetuated by America's history of racism?
Yeah, it's, one of the literatures that I've dipped into recently, again, is just the people that write about the interrelations between the history of slavery and the history of the carceral state, right? And that sort of draw connections between plantations and prisons, and think across time about how these different institutions have done similar work. So we get rid of slavery, and then we have prisons or chain gangs, and then there are these storylines that get told. And one of the things that there's a lot to those narratives, and the ways in which we talk in terms of the new Jim Crow, like we take something from one period and sort of see it kind of manifest again in another period. And I think one of the things that I think is important to remember is it's never quite the same, and also to guard against too much pessimism in our thinking about sort of these historical developments. I mean, that there is a way in which there's a depressing degree of continuity across time in terms of, as I was saying earlier, the ways in which these forms of discrimination seems to replicate themselves or manifest themselves in new forms that do much of the same work over time. But history also teaches that there's a lot of contingency to these developments in terms of how they play out. And there are at least storylines that historians have been able to recover that offer alternative visions, paths not taken, promises that were lost but could be regained. And so I think as with many of my colleagues in legal history, we spend a lot of time talking about contingency to fight against inevitability as the sort of conclusion, or the sort of, here it goes again, and of course this is what's going to happen, because that can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so I think one of the most important things historians do towards helping, in addition to just being an intrinsically important enterprise, which I very much believe it is, it's also profoundly important as a kind of set of examples and sort of resources towards thinking forward about what to do about social problems, because precisely because it's not entirely new. What we're facing now is not something that is entirely unprecedented. There are all sorts of resources we can draw upon because people have thought about this before very seriously and carefully. And certain kinds of ways of thinking may not have been on the winning side of the ledger at a particular moment in time in terms of how people voted or what people with power decided to do in particular moments, but that it exists as a body of learning and knowledge of an incredibly important sort. And so that's what I think most of us who are historians in this area spend our time doing right now, is thinking about how to provide, you can think about it as a legal historian. I think about it all the time as sort of a, when you're litigating, you have a choice between different kinds of theories that you might use as a basis for arguing, and historical episodes often provide the kind of material through which to argue for something. And a suggestion that there are, this isn't the only way to think about how to punish. There are other ways to think about how to punish, for instance. And so I think one of the most valuable things that we can do as historians is to provide the material for legal argument in various ways. And that's something that I work very hard at in my own work.
Do you think that there's a particular law that exists that needs to be changed, or that doesn't yet exist that needs to, that you are thinking right now, oh, here is the moment, here's the opportunity to elevate this thing through the stories and arguments that we can tell about why this was needed before and it's definitely needed now, and we can capitalize on the sort of momentum that this moment gives to make this happen and make something right that hasn't been wrong, or that makes something right that has been wrong? There we are.
Well, one of the things I'm thinking about, I have a couple of colleagues that are doing this right now, and because I'm supposedly not teaching this year, I wasn't going to do this, but it does feel like that the idea is to do a course about utopias, or utopian thinking. And again, because I think more than anything else that moments of disruption that are this extensive, do provide opportunity. I immediately think of a colleague of mine who studies the 1918 pandemic, and was asked what happened after that. Because everyone thinks the world will not be the same after this moment, and he's like, nothing really changed. And so he was suggesting there will be no fundamental transformation coming out of our current pandemic. I'd like to push back against that, at least, again, why assume it's inevitable that just because that was what happened in 1918/1919, it's destined to be the case this time? I'd like to believe that could be otherwise, and so I do want to think very hard about what kinds of things could be on the table, and I see people already doing that. I think it's just amazing to see how those who are involved in prison reform have just moved to the front of the they're actively engaged in litigation right now. There's a whole clearinghouse that I have colleagues in Michigan that are doing, and we're doing here in UCLA that is really tracking this in a sort of real-time way, and so you can see materially the effect this is immediately having, that people are seizing upon this opportunity. So I think that's why I'm intrigued by the idea of a course like this, where we sort of start to think about, we got some time here. this pandemic is going to stay with us for much longer than we wanted to, but given that, there is a real opportunity, I think, to think carefully and systematically about how this moment reveals, because it is a deeply revealing moment, inequities and forms of deprivation that are crying out for redress. And so I would like to think, especially the site of a law school is a place where mobilizing both history and law together provide a kind of framework within which to think forward about what really we can do with this moment in a very positive way. There's all these silver linings that people are grasping at every day that are, more modest in their forms. I learned how to bake bread, or which I did, but I do think we can do more than that, and I hope that I believe that we will. I'm very confident. I see evidence of it all around, both at our law school and elsewhere.
One question that's come to mind for me in all of the discussion is whether or not the privatization of our prisons is something that will be rethought at this point, that there was some sort of contractual relationship made between the government and these private companies, and that now there's a default on some of the promises that were made that really are government promises to the people incarcerated there, with the middleman of private industry. Do you anticipate that there will be some changes in who is providing our incarceration system with its services going forward?
Yeah, there's a ton of really interesting questions here about the public and private relationship, both in this context and in a lot of others, right? I mean, we've been living through a neoliberal moment, and the big question at this stage of things is, will we see a renegotiation of the relationship between individuals and the state, between corporations and the state? And so, I mean, I think again, this could be a moment of profound transformation or not. I don't know yet, and I don't think anyone does, right, in terms of the reverberations and their effects on the economy in particular. That's a big unknown right now. But I think you're right to put your finger on the ways in which the privatization of prisons in the last several decades in particular, but it's a longer process, will be affected by this. I immediately wonder about sort of the liability. Where do you locate the liability if people are getting sick within prisons, right? Is it going to be the government, or are they insulated for some reason from liability as a result of the fact that it's public provision? And how do we think about it if it is instead sort of being kind of managed by a private corporation? Or, is Congress going to insulate them from any kind of lawsuits? I don't know. I mean, I think it's an unknown at this point what will happen with that, and then how that will affect sort of the kind of business of sort of running prisons, and who's going to be wanting to do that going forward if there is some sort of liability exposure to doing that in this time. So I don't know exactly how that's going to look down the road, but I think it's just part and parcel of this big, interesting question about what happens to our ideas about government as a result of living through this experience. I think that we're seeing such polarization about that right now. And then there's going to be an election, which I think will be very revealing as far as that goes. And so it's if it wasn't so horrible, it's really also very interesting to be seeing this happen in this particular moment. This just throws a wrench in a lot of, I think, plans and ways of talking about healthcare. And it's just really going to be interesting to watch how the messaging changes in the next few months as we get closer to the election, how people talk about Obamacare in a time and a place where we're all living through a public health emergency.
So since we are in Minnesota, sort of switching gears to Minnesota's response, I know recently the ACLU of Minnesota actually filed suit against the DOC because Moose Lake Prison has a COVID outbreak in every unit. So do you think that just because of the nature of prisons that sort of can't be avoided, or do you think there was something about Minnesota's response and the Department of Corrections here in Minnesota that led to that unfortunate outcome?
Yeah, I mean, I've been keeping an eye on Minnesota in relationship to the rest of the country, and I don't think, it's hard to say. I mean, it's awful to see any kinds of impacts like Moose Lake anywhere, and yet I think it's happening everywhere. I don't know what the status of the lawsuit is right now, but again, these lawsuits are happening all over the country, so I think Minnesota is not unique in that regard or standing out in particular, and it's not an outlier. I mean, there are some states that are not doing anything. There's all sorts of in addition to early release and medical release and all sorts of things that are being done with parole and probation and medical co-pays and things like that. Minnesota has been pretty much doing a sort of reasonable amount of accommodation to the circumstances in line with, I think, the more progressive and forward-thinking states in that regard. So I think that I mean, it will be interesting to see what happens with this lawsuit. I mean, I've been sort of amazed by some of the pushback that I've seen, that some states are pushing back in these obvious situations where, of course, there are things that they can do to ameliorate the circumstances. They're kind of pushing back on technical grounds. And that surprises me a little bit. It just seems like a tremendous waste of everyone's time to gum up the works with those kinds of arguments right now. But I am hopeful that what a lawsuit like the ACLU's does is really just kind of keep the pressure up on prison administrators to make sure that they are taking care, because I think that's the best thing that these suits can do right now, is to encourage people to do the right thing, and make sure that the accountability is there. And I think that's what I hope will happen.
I know for time, we just have one more question and then we can get to Jen's closing. So you mentioned early releases just in this last response. And I know earlier in our conversation, you had sort of talked about whether prisons are sort of the right rehabilitation, punishment setup. So since we are seeing this onslaught of early releases, like what should we make of that? Does that sort of challenge or reinforce the idea that we are almost needlessly using the tool of incarceration in today's society?
Yeah, I mean, I think if there's a bottom line to what we're finding in this moment and what we're seeing in this moment, what this moment renders visible, it is that the complex of institutions that we call prisons and just the criminal justice system in many ways is broken. And in a way that there's an opportunity to do something about it, not just because of COVID-19 and what kinds of emergent measures are deemed to be necessary because of it, but also, I mean, if you think about it, before this happened, that was one of the areas where you see bipartisan support for reform is in criminal justice. Not they're coming at it different parts of the political sort of different aspects of the political spectrum are coming at this from very different perspectives. They different. Some just want to cost cut. Some think that this is just fundamentally wrong from a moral and philosophical kind. So there are lots of different ways of coming to this moment and thinking that something needs to be done. But again, in a certain respect, that may be just the only way to move beyond what is, I think, a kind of human rights violation, set of human rights violations that are just daily visited upon different populations. And so, from that standpoint, I really would just come back to what I said at the beginning, which is that this is the one way in which I'm willing to say there's a silver lining to all this, is if and when it does actually cause us to see and do something about this. It's not short-term, but long-term and thoroughgoing, that there's a real rethinking of not just among academics writing articles, but not just different kinds of civil rights organizations that are bringing suits, but that there's really, throughout our society, a rethinking of sort of how we punish and why we punish in a way that has real institutional effects. I think that in my most hopeful moments, I think that there's a way in which, to come back to the idea of we're in this together, that the sense of interdependency does lead us to bring those who are incarcerated back within the realm of sort of the community of concern that we all have, and that we realize that our fates are bound up with each other in ways that manifest themselves institutionally. That would be my highest hope.
Well, we're so grateful to be able to talk to you today. And I think both Abby and I had anticipated this is a heavy conversation. It will be full of things that feel, intractable as challenges or just very sad. And I think I speak for Abby too, that we find you so hopeful, that in the midst of all of the things that you think about that are really hard, that it seems like you've found ways to bring your own personal hopefulness into those facts and stories. And I think we're just really grateful to be able to bring that to our viewers as well. And so thank you so much for taking the time to be with us here today. We're just enormously grateful.
Well, I want to add that I think that thing that keeps me going is the work with students like you who take this moment as a time and a place to think carefully and critically about what can be done. I will say that one of the first things that I noticed when the announcement was made to go online and all sorts of things were shut down, including commencement. I mean, just immediately there were all sorts of communications to you that I can't imagine were anything but stressful and disappointing. And what I noticed was that the Law Council, like one of the first things that everyone was just doing without skipping a beat was thinking about mutual aid. And I remember seeing that and just thinking, wow, that's what University of Minnesota law students do. In the face of difficulties and challenges. And so that's what gives me hope, is being able to work with, engage with, think together with students like you who recognize that there's a tremendous amount of privilege in having a law degree and opportunity that you'll be able to mobilize in ways that can help and make a difference. And so I just admire the work that you do, and I'm grateful for it.
It's very mutual. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, to our viewers, thank you so much for joining us. We hope that you really benefited as much as we did from talking with Professor Blumenthal today, and wanted to let you know that there are other videos available if you're interested in seeing what other editors are thinking about with other areas that include reproductive rights, eviction and housing issues, domestic violence and gender-related issues, and the COVID-19 pandemic. We'd encourage you to check those out as well. And there will be more interviews to come, so stay tuned.